Good day, class. The focus of this video is the subdominant function, harmonies that lead to 5 at a cadence. So we're looking at 4s and at 2s. And in particular, I want to focus on how bass lines are often a clue to help you locate the subdominant, specific scale degrees in the bass that are often going to be our clue. Let's have a look at some analysis. Vincenzo Bellini is best known as a composer of opera, but here we'll have a look at a passage from his Oboe Concerto in E-flat major. Notice that although the whole piece is in E-flat major, this particular passage we're focusing on is in G minor, and it features one of the best known chord progressions that there is in classical tonal music. 1, 4, 5, or 5, 7, 1. A few things to mention about this example. First, let's focus on the embellishing tones in the melody. Here, Bellini uses the small note notation to show appoggiaturas. As you'll remember, appoggiaturas are a fancy word for accented incomplete neighbors. So in the second measure of the example, F is an incomplete neighbor to E flat. The F is an accented or strong beat note. It's approached by skip and then moves down by step in the manner of an incomplete neighbor. And historically, these were called appoggiaturas. Same thing in the fourth measure of the example with the C, which is approached by skip and moves down by step to B flat. Second thing, when we move by harmony from 4 to 5, we have to watch out for parallel fifths. For example, on the 4 chord, we have C in the bass and G in the top voice of the orchestra. It will be very easy in the next chord to have D and A, but that would be parallel fifths. So instead, as C moves up to D in the bass, G has to move down to F sharp. This is the use of contrary motion which we need to avoid parallel fifths. And in fact, the propensity of writing parallel fifths when 4 moves to 5 may be one reason composers often substitute other subdominant functioning chords instead of 4. And we'll see in this video many examples where composers opt for other options for subdominant besides 4, possibly in part to avoid parallel fifths. Francis, or Frank Johnson, is recognized as the first African-American composer to have his music published as sheet music, which is a remarkable accomplishment given that he was active in the antebellum period, that is, the period leading up to the American Civil War. Besides being a prolific composer, he was also a virtuoso on the keyed bugle. Although much of his music was written for band, it mostly survives today in piano transcriptions such as the one you see here. Let's have a listen. How often do you hear a change of harmony? And what type of subdominant chord does Johnson use in this example? So Johnson has opted, instead of composing 1, 4, 5, 1, to write 1, 2, 6, 5, 1. This is extremely common. In fact, some composers use 2, 6 almost exclusively and rarely use 4. Why might a composer like to do this? I can think of 2 reasons. First, as I mentioned before, when you write 4 going to 5, it's easy to write parallel fifths. So writing 2, 6 instead helps avoid those parallel fifths. Another reason is, when we have a 4 chord and then a 5 chord in major, those are both major chords. But if I have 2, 6 going to 5, that gives a minor chord followed by a major chord. So there's a little more variety. I wanted to point out just how similar a 2, 6 chord and a 4 chord are. So in this case, the 2, 6 chord has D in the bass, has F sharp, and has a B. Whereas if it were a 4 chord, it would still be D in the bass, it would have an F sharp, and it would have an A. So 2 out of the 3 notes are the same. It's the same bass note, so it's very easy to substitute a 2/6 chord for a 4 chord. So I'd like to encourage you to get used to seeing 2/6s as subdominant harmonies, leading to the dominant at a cadence. Let's turn now to a duet by Sophie Gail. I've mentioned in previous videos that many phrases of music begin with tonic expansions, such as this one here, followed by a cadential progression, a progression of chords that leads to a cadence. So 3 things I'd like you to think about as we listen to this example. First of all, what type of cadence does it end with? Secondly, what type of predominant harmony helps lead to the dominant? And third, how can we use bass lines as a clue to identify when we've ended the tonic expansion and begun the cadential progression, begun leading toward a cadence? Whereas in the previous example we heard 2/6 going to 5 in a major key, here we have essentially the same progression but in a minor key. So it's 2 diminished 6 going to 5. If you take a look at that 2 diminished 6 chord, it's A, C, E flat. That's a diminished triad. And as I mentioned before, often a composer might prefer to use a 2 diminished 6 chord because it has an appealing variety of chord qualities. So the intensity of the diminished chord, followed by perhaps the sweetness of a major chord, makes for an interesting variety of chords. Another thing I'd really like to emphasize here, one way to recognize a cadential progression, often the bass line involves scale degree 4 going to scale degree 5. Scale degree 4 representing the subdominant function, and scale degree 5 representing the arrival at the dominant function. So that could be in the progression 4-5, or 2-6-5, or here 2 diminished 6-5. In any case, we have a bass line of 4 going to 5. That's quite common as subdominant harmonies move to dominant harmonies at a cadence. Less common, but still quite possible, is going from scale degree 6 down to scale degree 5. So the idea is that many subdominant functioning harmonies involve moving in the bass by step, either from 4 to 5 or 6 to 5. Let's listen to this once more, and I'd like you to focus on 2 things. First of all, the sound, the intensity of 2 diminished 6 going to 5, and secondly, this bass line of scale degree 4, C, going to scale degree 5, D, as we approach the cadence. Let's see if the same principle applies here in this excerpt from a Mazurka by Chopin. A Mazurka is a type of a Polish dance. Chopin composed quite a number of them. So what we're looking for is a motion in the bass from scale degree 4 to scale degree 5. Let's listen to the excerpt focusing on the bass line. One thing to think about, how often is there a change of bass note in this piece? Should we be looking at bass notes on every quarter note, on every measure, every few measures? How do we think about where the bass notes are, and where do we hear a motion to scale degree 4 in the bass, moving to scale degree 5? Here, if we focus on the left-hand accompaniment for a moment, this is in the style that's sometimes called pa. Often we hear that pa accompaniment in waltzes, or in this case it's in a mazurka. And the important principle is to think that the notes on the downbeats, the count as the bass notes. The pa are more like inner voices. So for instance, for the first few bars of the piece, we should really think of the bass line as re, la, re, la, re. And think of those bass notes as lasting for the whole measure, as if the note rings for 3 beats, even though it's literally notated as 1 beat. So that means we have a tonic expansion moving that extends from the beginning of the piece all the way through the downbeat of 5. But then if we take the second system, starting from 5, the bass notes would be re, sol, la, re. That's where we have that motion from scale degree 4 in the bass to scale degree 5, moving from G to A. And that's a clue that what's going on there is our subdominant function moving toward our dominant function, helping us to make the cadential progression. So we'll analyze that part of the phrase in just a moment, but first let's take a closer look at the melody in the first few bars of the piece. Let's think a little bit about which notes are chord tones and which are embellishing tones. That will help us a little bit with the analysis to take a closer look at the melody first. I've labeled in green each of the embellishing tones in the melody for the first few bars of the piece. Most of them are pretty straightforward, but the one that's a little bit tricky is the downbeat of measure 2. I've called that F sharp a suspension. Here's my reasoning. If we start from the 3rd beat of bar 1, we have F sharp in the melody, G as a neighbor, then that neighbor goes back down to F sharp on the downbeat of bar 2, but by that point that F sharp isn't a chord tone any longer. How can we explain that? Well, my thinking is, what if we removed that neighbor tone at the end of the first measure? What if we imagined that the F sharp from toward the end of measure 1 was tied over the bar line to the F sharp on the downbeat of bar 2? It would sound something like this. So that version sounds a lot more like a typical suspension, and my idea is that was the model for what Chopin composed. He just added a little neighbor note in between the preparation and the suspension. It makes it a little bit more of an abstract suspension. If you buy this analysis, if what you just heard sounds to you like a model for the piece as Chopin composed it, then you're accepting the premise that on the downbeat of bar 2, that F sharp is a decoration, is some kind of embellishing tone of the E that follows. I've called it a suspension. There might be other ways to think about it. So if you hear that way, then we could also imagine a version that was even further simplified, where the F sharp on the downbeat of beat 2 could be replaced by the E that it embellishes. That would sound something like this. So these audio examples have guided us toward hearing the F sharp on the downbeat of bar 2 as an embellishing tone. I've called it a suspension, decorating the E that follows. I wanted to take a moment to think about those notes because they come back in bars 5 and 6, and they'll affect our harmonic analysis of those bars. So now let's take a second to think about the harmonies in the second half of this excerpt, bars 5, 6, 7, and 8. So that's the cadential part of the phrase, the part of the phrase that leads to a cadence. What kind of harmony do we have in bar 6 in particular? That would be the subdominant function. What is the harmony there? I'll give you a second to pause the video, think about it, and then we can take a look at it together. Well, here's a clue. If in measure 2, the F sharp in the melody is an embellishing tone decorating an E, we'll probably tend to hear it the same way in measure 6. That means the harmony in measure 6 doesn't have a G and an F sharp, it has a G and an E. That makes the harmony in measure 6 an E minor chord, 2-6, E, G, B. You can see that quite clearly in the left hand of the piano. If you look at the papa, the is a G, and the papa has B and E. In the melody, we have an F sharp. That's a suspension decorating an E. Following measure 2 as a model, we have something quite similar in measure 6. So the progression in the last 4 bars of this excerpt are 1, 2-6 is our subdominant harmony, 5-7 going to 1 as a perfect authentic cadence. Let's listen to the whole excerpt once more, and again I'll direct your attention to the bass line. Focus on the ums of the papa, and we'll hear bass line going from scale degree 4 to 5, indicating subdominant moving to dominant. We'll end this video with an art song by Louise Reichardt, Durch die bunten Rosenhecken, through the colorful rose hedge. The poem has a lot of springtime imagery, but you'll hear the music actually sets it in quite an intense, dramatic way that a little bit belies the tone of the text. As we listen, how many phrases do you hear here? Or to put it another way, where do we hear cadences? Or to put it yet another way, where do we hear subdominant harmonies moving to dominance as a marker of cadence? One clue that I've really wanted to emphasize today is how bass lines can help you. If you find places with scale degree 4 going to scale degree 5 in the bass, B flat going to C, that is a clue that you're probably hearing a cadential progression. So let's focus on the bass line as we listen to this excerpt from the song.
Durch die bunten Rosenhecken flattern Schmetterlinge hin, muntre Lerchentöne wecken schon die Tageskönigin. Immer wahr.
Well, the passage starts off with a tonic expansion, if I ever heard one. Taking a look at the bass line in the first 2 full measures, we have F, 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 F. That's a tonic pedal. That's clearly expanding tonic. How about the harmonies that follow, starting in bar 3, going to the downbeat of bar 4? We're going to skip the second half of bar 3 where it's marked skip. But how about those harmonies there? We have a bass line of B flat going to C on the downbeat of bar 4. Is that a subdominant moving to dominant? If so, which type of subdominant and what kind of cadence does it lead to? Our subdominant harmony on the word Schmetterlinge, meaning butterfly, is a 2 half diminished 6/5 chord. That's G, B flat, D flat, F. In my opinion, 2 half diminished 6/5 is quite a flavorful or a rich color for a subdominant harmony. And that gets us then to a half cadence on the word hin, the downbeat of bar 4. Again, we're going to skip over the second half of bar 3 for the time being. The main point is that we move from the subdominant 2 half diminished 6/5 to the dominant 5 on the word hin. That's finished our first phrase with a half cadence. I'd like to point out, notice that there's a rhyming pair in the German text, Schmetterlinge hin, and then at the end of this excerpt, Tageskönigin. That's a clue because composers often set rhyming pairs in some kind of parallel way. So if we arrive at a cadence on hin, maybe we also arrive at a cadence on gin in bar 8. That's something to listen for. Okay, so I've written quite a few question marks. What happens after we get to that 5 chord for the half cadence? The music seems to intensify as we get there. What's going on in the harmony for the next few bars? What kinds of chords do we have? And as a clue, let's focus on the bass line starting in bar 4. What's going on in the bass and how is that a clue harmonically? Let's listen to the excerpt once more.
Durch die bunten Rosenhecken flattern Schmetterlinge hin, bunte Lerchentöne wecken schon die Tageskönigin. Immer war
Well, when I mention how intense the harmonies sound in this passage, let's think about the reason why. In measure 4, we have just a 5 triad, C, E, G. But in measure 5, it turns into a 7th chord, C, E, G, B flat. And by the end of bar 5, C, E, G, B flat, D flat, that is a 5-9. That's quite an intense sonority. Continuing on the next downbeat, Wecken, it's still a 5-7 chord. And then at the end of that bar, we have a harmony we haven't quite studied yet in this course, but let's think about it. The notes we have are E natural, G, B flat, D flat. That is a 7 fully diminished chord in 4-3 position. Quite an unstable or a dissonant sounding chord. Notice the tritone between the B flat in the bass and the E natural in the upper voice. That tritone resolves to the downbeat of bar 7, where we have to look together at the harmonies. Just a little clue about the harmonies in bar 7 and 8. We haven't worked through them yet, but I notice a bass line of 3, 4, 5, 5, 1 in terms of scale degrees. That's a clue about what type of chord progression we have in those 2 bars. I'll give you a second to pause the video and think about those harmonies in 7 and 8 in the progression that we have here. I've marked one harmony skip. I wrote SK for skip because that's a harmony we haven't studied yet, but the rest of the harmonies you should be able to analyze. So pause the video, give that some thought, and then we'll discuss. Something we've seen in almost every example today is bass lines of 4, 5, indicating subdominant harmony moving to dominant harmony. But to add a little bit to that, often that's expanded to be 3, 4, 5, 1. That's what we have here. We have scale degree 3 in the bass on the downbeat of bar 7. That's a 1-6 chord. Then we have scale degree 4 in the bass for a subdominant harmony. In this case, that's a minor 4 chord. We're going to skip the 3rd beat. That's a chord we're going to talk about in a couple weeks. And then on the last beat of the bar, we have a 5-7 chord, C, E natural, G, B flat, resolving on the downbeat of bar 8 to 1 to make a PAC. As I mentioned earlier, we have a rhyming pair between the half cadence on the word hin, downbeat of bar 4, and gin on the downbeat of bar 8. So that rhyme lines up with those 2 cadences. Let's listen to this once more and then we'll wrap up.
Durch die bunten Rosenhecken flattern Schmetterlinge hin, bunte Lerchentöne wecken schon die Tageskönigin. Immer war
So a few main tips and takeaways from this video. The subdominant function is not just the 4 chord. 2 chords are also very common, and specifically 2 chords in first inversion, 2-6 or 2-6-5. The reason 2 chords can be so common is they can avoid the issue with parallel fifths that sometimes arise when moving from 4 to 5, and also because they have an interesting chord quality because the 4 and the 5 will be different chord qualities. Whether it's a 4 chord or a 2-6 chord or a 2-6-5, keep in mind all of these involve scale degree 4 in the bass. And that's the reason why bass lines moving from scale degree 4 to 5 often express subdominant moving to dominant functions at an approaching cadence. Less commonly, we can have scale degree 6 moving to 5 to be the subdominant function to dominant function. We haven't seen that in today's video, but we've seen that in some other examples we've analyzed earlier in the course. That's it for this video. Have a nice week.